Let's review the base M3 Pro inside the 14-inch MacBook Pro and see how does it perform. We are also going to compare this against the top M3 Pro inside a 16-inch MacBook Pro as well. And there's a lot of data points to share, and some may actually surprise you. So let's get started. This is ArtIsRight. A big welcome and thank you to those of you who have already subscribed to the channel. If you're new, please consider doing so because I'll be releasing a lot more of these videos and you definitely don't want to miss them. Something that all of you can definitely do to help me is to tap on that like button. This way YouTube algorithm will share this video with an even larger audience and new one as well. As usual, I'll be sharing with you a lot of information. I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. And I'll also leave timestamp in the description if I remember to do that. If not, it will come at a later date. If you find the information that I'm sharing with you helpful, please consider supporting the channel. I'll leave a link to my tip jar in the description. YouTube Super Thanks works as well. Something new that I'm trying out is a membership. It's 99 cents a month. You can cancel this at any time, but you're definitely going to get priority replies on the comments that you leave in the videos or questions that you ask. And because I'm getting a lot more comments now, this is a good opportunity for you to really join in on this membership. All right, with that being said, we are going to look at this system that is our primary one. So both of them are going to be the M3 Pro. One of them is the 14-inch one. The other one is the 16-inch model. And we are looking at the base M3 Pro versus the top M3 Pro. And with this, we're looking at 11 CPU versus 12 CPU. So the difference on this has one more performance core in the top M3 Pro. With regards to GPU, we have gone up from 14 to 18, so 4 more, and NPUs remain the same, including the memory bandwidth as well. 18 gigabytes of memory on both of these because they are the same generation, 512 gigabyte SSD, and both of these are stock configuration. Now, granted, when we take a look at the pricing of these two, there is some variation because of the size of the machine as well. But you're going to see a little bit later on as well, I'm going to show you this configuration in a 14-inch model, and you can see the price variations there. All right. These are the initial test system that I'll be sharing as well. There is the Pro from the M1 generation, M2 Max from the M1, M2, and also M3 Max results going to be here, including all the regular M chips as well, M1, M2, M3. And also, one thing I definitely want to talk about in this cycle is memory bandwidth, because it does seem a little bit confusing at times when you see the previous generation has a higher memory bandwidth and the new one has lower. The answer to that is in this video that I will link in the description. I have actually done the test on the M1 generation, and this is going from the M1 Pro to the M1 Max. The memory bandwidth variation between these two SoC is 200 versus 400, yet the performance on the same 32 gigabyte is pretty much almost exactly the same. Most of the app that we use nowadays can't really go in and utilize all of these memory bandwidth that is there in these chips. So Apple is really being forward thinking and hoping that the app would catch up, but we're really not quite there yet. So that's what you want to check out. Additional test reference system, I will have the M1 Ultra and also the M2 Ultra result here as well. And yes, M2 Ultra is 24 core CPU and not 40. So note on that one. And I will also throw in the result on the Razer Blade 18 where it is appropriate. This is the configuration for the machine, and I'll also leave a link to the benchmark I've done with that machine specifically in the description too. There are many more videos to come. This is why you want to subscribe to the channel and make sure you check out the videos that I have already done as well, covering the M3 generation, the M3 Pro, and also the M3 Max separately, and how this compared to the previous gen, so you definitely want to check those out. All right, one thing that I do want to mention is that everything has been retested, so the clean OS installation of macOS Sonoma 14.1 or 14.1.1. So that is something that's definitely happening here. So many of you have been saying that it's missing one thing in this review, and that is the battery test. My answer to that is, well, I've done a battery test on the M1 generation before, and in different mode, low power mode, the auto, and also high power on the Max chip. I'll leave a link to that video in the description. I highly recommend that you check that out, because even just constantly rendering on those machines, you can still last for an entire flight across the continental United States. For example, a flight from LA to New York. It's more than enough time for you to cover your creative workflow for that entire flight. So when it comes to battery testing, these are so good now that I will be sitting in front of the computer forever. So chances are I probably won't be running a battery test. My recommendation is to get the size and the shape of a laptop that you need for your workflow. Don't think about the fact that if you get, for example, the 14-inch because you want the lightweight and you get the Max and the battery life is going to be terrible. You have to really ask yourself, it's going to be terrible relative to what? relative to another machine? Possibly. But also, you're only going to own that machine. So the fact that, you know, it may run a little bit shorter, but it's still much longer than what have come already before, is something to really think about here. So everything is relative. All right, display calibration passed for both software calibration with Calibrite Profiler and HL devices inside these XDR displays, and also works with external hardware calibrated display. BenQ Palette Master Ultimate works without any problems. This is going to be a pro photo review and a single app testing because I want to see how the silicon's performing one generation to the next, and I know that we all multitask, so if you do that, just get more RAM for your system. As far as test configuration go, this is the one that I have in the studio. Like I said in so many of these videos already, there are complaints about this is not the same, that's not the same. I mean, I hear you, but these are the resources that I have, and I'm using these to run the test. So these are going to be what it is. And the other thing too is that we have to start to extrapolate the data. There's no way I'm going to order every sub configuration into the studio. It's just financially not feasible. And the other thing too is that we're in the 3rd generation of these machines already. We already know the effect of the RAM, the SSD on the system, also even the size of a laptop in general. So we have a pretty good idea and a pretty good grasp on this. This is how you're going to read the specs. I'll leave a timestamp in the description. You can come back to this. All right, let's quickly talk about the SSD. Internal SSD, once you configure it, you cannot really expand this, or not easily, that anyone like me and you can do it anyway. And it is something that you can expand externally by plugging in a drive, where that would be a spinning drive, SSD, NAS, or DAS. You can totally do that without any problems. So if you configure it smaller and you need more storage space, you can definitely run it that way. As far as SSD speed go, this is the numbers that we are looking at right now for these computers. As far as the M3 Pro, they are pretty much performing the same. The 16-inch one and also the 14-inch one, you can see like they're pretty much within a few megabytes per second of each other. And that's really good to see, because it's telling us that even in the 512 gigabyte model, we're getting a faster SSD inside this model. And this is something that I have noted on the M2 review already. All right. So the question that some of you may be asking is that assets stored internally versus externally, is there any difference in terms of performance? My answer to that is no. And I have made an extensive video testing this out. I highly recommend you check it out. Links will be in the description for this. All right. When it comes to memory, the RAM on the system, you have to really be cognizant of this and really consider your use case and your modality. If you're crazy like me, have too many browsers and too many tabs open, having too many programs running at the same time, then definitely configure your system with more RAM. Remember that it is not upgradable, very similar to the SSD. There's no way to expand it because unlike an SSD, you cannot plug in extra RAM into your system. Whatever is on that SoC is it. So think about the RAM carefully. If you're going to keep your machine longer, I would say definitely consider bumping up the RAM. Is something that will definitely help. And remember that it is shared between the CPU and GPU. And even though this is a unified memory architecture, less is not more, less is still less. And for pro applications, if you need the memory, well, you're going to need the memory. So definitely configure your machine properly. One thing that Pro can do, that I've said this in so many videos already, is to restart the machine, launch activity monitor, go to the memory tab, monitor memory pressure, tile it in a way that you can see, and start running your Pro application, going through your normal workflow as you would in a normal day. If you're in the green, you're good. If you're in the yellow, you want to upgrade the RAM, or definitely consider upgrading that in your next machine. If you're in the red, time for definitely to upgrade the RAM. All right. Another program that I use to monitor my usage is iStatMenu. Links will be in the description. Love this program. Highly recommend it. If you are an Intel Mac user, recommendation is to keep the RAM the same, if not more than your current system. Do the memory pressure, monitor that, see how you're using it right now. But because you're coming from an Intel generation to the Apple Silicon, don't think that unified memory is going to enable you to work with less memory. If your apps like Lightroom needs memory, especially all the Adobe apps that really love to use memory, you definitely want to use more RAM in your system. My recommendation for Pro is to go with 32 plus or 36 gigabyte plus in this generation now. And part of it too that we have to remember is that when we configure our machine, for example, with 16 or 18 gigabytes of memory, not all of that is available for our apps to go in and use, because the operating system is already using memory when it starts up already, when it's even in idle, without running any apps. So that's another thing to think about as well. Now let's look at Lightroom Classic 13.0.1, one-to-one preview for 1000 Nikon D850 file. We can see that the base M3 Pro is performing slower, in fact by quite a bit of a margin compared to the top M3 Pro. Now, is this something that is going to be a trend that we're going to see? Well, we're going to find out really soon. But one of the things that I will tell you as an observation during this test is that on the base SoC inside the 14-inch one, the efficiency core are pretty much running at idle for majority of a test, meaning that the cores aren't being utilized fully, whereas on the top M3 Pro specs, the 16-inch model, all the cores are definitely being utilized at close to 100%. So something is definitely going on that is giving us the result we're seeing right now. And let's continue to see if this is the result we're going to see in the other tests as well. How does this add up to the rest of the lineup of the computer? Well, here's the two M3 Pro machines in the lineup. I mean, it's still performing much better than many other machines before, although by a smaller margin, for example, on the base M3 Pro SoC. So that's something to note there. Now let's take a look at export for these 1000 files. This is a task that uses both CPU and GPU, whereas the import one only uses the CPU. So with this, the advantage is not necessarily in the top M3 Pro SoC anymore. It has more CPU, it has more GPU. It's also in a 16-inch chassis that has better thermal dissipation, but it's not doing that much better. In fact, the base M3 Pro is pulling forward by close to 30 seconds. So think about that for just a moment here. This is telling us that the base M3 Pro is definitely a good proposition. And I would say, if you have to look at the price variation, it's probably a better proposition than the top M3 Pro SoC. Let's add this to the rest of the chart in the lineup, and we can see that the two M3 Pros are pretty much right there, just slightly behind the M3 Max. Now think about this for a second. That M3 Max machine that I just pointed out is $4,000. This 14-inch M3 Pro is $2,000. We're talking about a 50% price variation, yet we're not really seeing a 50% bump in performance. And the other thing too is that all of these now are within a close striking distance to the M2 Ultra and also the M1 Ultra. Now they're still faster by more than, I would probably say, 50 or 60% or so. But nonetheless, it's really getting up there in terms of the timing that is taking for that. All right, let's take a look at Lightroom Classic HDR Merge 9 Nikon D810 file and see how does this perform. Pretty much exactly the same. Now this is a CPU-based task and is really only going in to utilize one or two core at the very most. And this is why we're seeing the result being the same, because they are exactly the same core. Add this to the rest of the lineup, and interestingly enough, we have the new M3 generation clustering at the top. In fact, the regular M3 is also clustering right at the top too, just a few seconds behind, is performing a little bit more in line with the previous Gen Pro machines and also the Max and also the Ultra. But nonetheless, these M3 Pros and Max machine are, showing a slight sign improvement, and the CPU speed is definitely improving here in this regard. What about Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge 314 megapixel DNG file from 14 Nikon D810? Let's take a look at the result here. Timing, interestingly enough, this is a RAM and a CPU based task, and yes, the RAM is the same between both of these machines. SSD is also the same, and you've seen in the beginning, the speed on this is almost the same as well. But interestingly enough, the 16-inch MacBook Pro that has the advantage in its court is pretty much performing, I would say, within 2 seconds apart. We're going to call that a margin of error, but it is supposed to be the slightly faster one, but is really not doing that. So this also could be the fact that, Lightroom is really not going to utilize that many CPU cores and is using more the memory. And that's probably the reason why we're seeing the result being pretty much just the same there. When we add this to the rest of the lineup, the two M3 Pros are pretty much right there. They're faster than the M1, M2 that come before it. And interestingly enough, this is a weird, interesting anomaly that I found out in my test. For some stupid reason, the M3 with less cores and 16 gigabytes of memory is performing faster. And I've ran this test a few times, and this is the result we're getting. So there's a lot of wonky result. This is very similar to the feeling that I had when we test the M2 generation chip between, for example, the 8 to 16 and 24 gigabytes of memory, where we're supposed to see an improvement in 24 gigabytes of memory. We weren't really seeing that in the early days at all. So something interesting to note there. Lightroom Classic AI Noise Reduction. This is a GPU-based task. It's supposed to be running on the NPU, but there are a lot of side effects, artifacting, color rendition issues. So that's the reason why it's still running on the GPU as of now. And this is showing that when you really go in and just tap on the GPU, well, pretty much the top spec one is going to perform better. Now you have to really ask yourself if spending that extra money for that performance is worth it, because we're talking about a few $100s here for a 4-second improvement in performance. Now, I've also received a comment about this as well, that I might have to rethink this test a little bit more. Instead of doing one image, I might actually do a group of images. So that's something that I'm working up to formulate right now. Might do an addendum video on that, so stay tuned. But how does this compare with the rest of the lineup for the machine? So the M3 Pro pretty much are clustering right near each other. They're a little bit faster than, for example, the M1 Pro, which is definitely good to see. It should be a generational improvement, but it's also trailing the M2 Pro a little bit as well. A lot of optimization issues happening here, right? Okay, let's continue. This is Lightroom 7, and this is the cloud version of Lightroom. And we can see when we use this app, it's really going to utilize the CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination together. And part of the reason why is because the export engine of this program is really good, and that's why I'm really showing this, even though many pros are not really using Lightroom CC anyway. All right, when we take a look at the result, the top spec one is definitely pulling ahead, but not by much. We're talking about 15 seconds at the very most. I mean, that's not really an impressive number by any means. And I still think that the base M3 Pro inside the 14-inch chassis is an extremely good value if you're looking to really save some money and get a good performance machine. How does this compare with the rest of the lineup? So let me find the M3 Pro. So we have one right there, and also we have one right there. Timing is pretty good. In fact, it is within reach of the M2 Max, even though I thought the M2 Max would perform faster than that. But we can see the result between the M2 Max and M1 Max. They're pretty much within the range of each other, so I wouldn't call them like, too far apart. But these are just the numbers to really think about and to do a consideration. Essentially, any Apple Silicon you buy at this point in time, you're getting really good performance out of them. It's just really configuring the right one for your workflow. That's really what it comes down to. All right, Capture One 23, version 16.3.0.76. Let's see how the import preview is going to perform. So interestingly enough, having one extra CPU core in compared to, for example, going from 11 to 12 is improving the time, but only by 37 seconds. Now, this, again, the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the top M3 Pro has the advantage of a larger chassis, better thermal dissipation, but we're also talking about Capture One, that you can really give it all the cores there are in the system, and it's not really performing that well because it's not really going to utilize all of those cores that are on the machine or the resources that is available to it. Comparing this with the rest of the lineup, these are pretty much the M3 Pro. And something that I have been noticing about Capture One that I want to share an observation is that it tends to perform a little bit better on the newer architecture, the newer chip that has like the faster CPU speed, but doesn't go in and max out all the CPU cores, which is one of those things where, if you just rely less on, for example, the frequency speed and go with pretty much the multi-threaded approach and utilizing many more cores that is available in the system, maybe we'll have a better performance time. And yes, also the toggle between doing the tether capture mode and just doing the image editing mode for previews and everything. All right, side note, I digress. Okay, Capture One Export for these 1000 Nikon D850 files. This is using the GPU, and this is a task that really go in and just use the GPU only. So 14 versus 18 core GPU, and the timing variation is pretty much nil. What, close to 45 seconds? Somewhere around that range. I'm just doing quick math in my head here. I don't think it's worth it to get, the M3 Pro top specs because, I mean, again, this is the top spec chip. It has more thermal dissipation inside the 16-inch one, yet it's not that significantly faster than the base one inside the 14-inch chassis. Comparing this with the rest of the lineup, again, we are taking a look at the result there that is just right in the middle. I mean, this is part of the reason why I highly recommend looking at, for example, the Max SoC when you're really running Capture One, because Capture One really goes in and utilizes that well. And when you get to the point where you're really just giving it way too many GPU cores, like on the Ultra, it doesn't do well. In fact, on the Max SoC, one of the things that I found out is that it tends to perform better if you go with the base Max SoC. For example, this 14-inch MacBook Pro M2 Max, that is the base Max SoC, and that is within striking distance of that one. This is also the reason why I said too that if you're using Capture One and Capture One only, the M2 Max base SoC are pretty much really a great buy for this right now. All right, Photoshop. Digital Lloyd Chamber test, link to his website will be in the description. We're using this as of now. Puja's system will be integrated later when the results are a little bit more stable. This way we can do generation testing. These are the 3 tests that I'm using from Digital Lloyd, and you can check it out yourself too. And when it comes to memory and performance on this one, this is pretty much just CPU, and we are seeing some slight variation. And when I say slight, we're talking about milliseconds. We're talking about reaction time that for majority of us, we can't even react that fast. So these, for the most part, are pretty much just about the same to a normal human perception. And when we add this to the rest of the chart, you can see that the M3 comes up at the very top. And this is also the reason why in the previous videos, I said if you want the best SoC for Photoshop right now, look at the M3, because these slightly faster core performance compared to the rest in the lineup running on the current operating system and the current software is really giving you an indicator. If you do a lot of Photoshop work and you want things to run really fast in Photoshop, this may be the way to look at it. And it may not necessarily have to be the Max SoC, but the Pro one is going to do just fine. Photoshop Medium, interestingly enough, everything else is the same. This is mostly RAM and also CPU. And in the 70% one, the 14-inch one's doing better. In the 90% range, they are performing just about the same. I would say within, half a second apart, you're really not going to notice that difference. Comparing this with the rest of the lineup, we can see that the M3 Pro, one of them is there, and the other M3 Pro is right in the middle. For this one, the 2 M3 Pros, they're going to be in the same relative position, but you start to get an idea that once we increase the memory on the system, these definitely do run faster. All right. What about Photoshop Huge, 56GB file? When it comes to this one, it did take a while to run these tests, and what it really comes down to is that the top spec one is faster by around 15 seconds. That's a few $100s for 15 seconds. Think about that for just a moment. Better thermal dissipation, true. Also, more cores, true. Also, more money as well. The base one is looking really good right now. All right. Comparing this with the rest of the lineup, what we can see right now is that the 16-inch M3 Pro is right here, and the 14-inch M3 Pro base is pretty much right there. They're not that far apart from each other. And I would just say like, hey, you know what? If this is something you do every now and then, it's fine. And just think about this for a second here. I forgot to mention this, that this 56GB file, this is much larger than memory. The other thing I also want to point out as well is that if you take a look at the clustering of timing, we're looking at 16GB memory cluster. We're looking at 32GB. And then the moment we go to 48 or higher, we start to reduce the time. So it's not just necessarily like a CPU. It's a lot of this is based on RAM as well. 56GB is way larger than the RAM is on the system, and it definitely has to go into paging or the system swap that is doing. So those are the things to really think about when you're really considering these tasks. Now, Final Cut Pro 10.6.1 encoder-decoder engine. How does this perform against each other? They're exactly the same encoder-decoder engine, so performance is exactly the same. You can see how it performs with the rest of the machine. In fact, all of these Pro machines perform pretty much almost in lockstep with the other Pro machines that have come before. No improvement in the encoder-decoder engine on this, something to note there. H.264 HEVC. Timing is exactly the same. And you may say that, you may expect the 16-inch to perform slightly faster because it has a better thermal dissipation, but we're also not really seeing that at the moment. ProRes 422, it is faster by around 2 seconds. I'm just going to attribute this to a margin of error on these machines, and you can see how they perform with the rest of the lineup there. And now let's take a look at After Effects. This is using Adobe Benchmark. We can see the timing. Now, something to note about After Effects is that there are two different Mercury engines that you can use for this. One that is just using the CPU, which is called a software rendering, and the other one that utilizes GPU as well. The GPU one, the caution is that it could cause some color artifacting to happen, posterization, color shifts, and so forth. That's why it is not enabled by default, but I've tested both on these. So the 14-inch one and the 16-inch one, and you can see the time variation is really small, the difference between the two. And when we compare, for example, the 14 and the 16, we're talking about just a minute or less than that apart. It's not really that big of a deal at all. So I still think the base SoC is really a great buy at this point in time. And when we compare the results, you can see this is where the 16-inch is, and the 14 one is straddling between, for example, the M1 Pro that is just using the software rendering right there, but the timing is really close to each other. So some of those factors to really think about in this regard, especially if you use this program. So anyway, what are some of my analysis, thoughts, and observation about all of this? Well, there is a huge lineup for the 14. You have the option to choose the regular M3, which I highly don't recommend for any pro workflow. If you are a student, if you're just starting out, if you're super limited on budget, maybe definitely look at that one. But the moment you really start to configure, for example, these M3 machines and add in 24 gigabytes of memory, you are within the doorstep of the M3 Pro already, and this is a much better buy option. Now, you can also configure the M3 Pro as a bump, and the way how Apple have pre-configured the stock model is that not only are they bumping up the SoC, but they're also bumping up the storage tier as well. So if you just choose this base one, you can just bump up the storage tier without having to really bump up the SoC. So that's something to think about. And there's also the max variation on this computer as well, which I don't think we're going to be testing on this cycle. When it comes to the 12-inch model, you're looking at just technically one M3 Pro configuration is both 1218. The only variation in this is pretty much double the amount of memory on your system. And that's why you're seeing the price variation between these two. Now, there's also the max SoC as well that shows the variation in the number of cores. We're going to be testing that later, so make sure you stay tuned to the channel for that. Okay, so let's take a look at the 14-inch one a little bit. So like I said before, you have the option to go in and update the SoC for $200 and gain those extra cores, but you already seen that the top one inside the 16-inch chassis that has a better advantage, better thermal, that's supposed to dissipate heat better and everything, is performing slower in some tasks. And in the tasks that it does beat out the base SoC, it's pretty much only by a small margin. Forget about the percentage, just look at the amount of time you're waiting longer. A minute and a half. I don't think that's a big deal at all. Personally, if I would recommend a setup for any one of you out there, I would say forget the M3 Pro chip upgrade, the SoC upgrade. And this is the same in the previous generation as well. For my recommendation, I don't really see a lot of point because the gain you're getting from it is really small. In the Pro workflow, what you're going to get more from this is to use that 200 as a deposit to really get to 36 gigabytes of memory. So technically, if you're going to use that 200 to upgrade the memory, you now just have to pay $200 more. And I think that's a much better compelling option for a machine, because combining these two together, you have a pretty good powerhouse based on the testing result we see here. And with 36 gigabyte memory, some of the tasks are going to run even faster as well. When it comes to the 16 gigabytes model, you don't have the option to really choose. You just have that top spec M3 SoC, and you have the option between the 18 and 36 gigabytes of memory. Now, if you need 36 gigabytes of memory, definitely go and upgrade this to that much. But so far, what I see is the base 14-inch upgraded memory. That is a winning combination as of now. All right. So that's my thoughts about those machines. And this is pretty much the 14-inch model with 36 gigabyte memory. You're looking at $23.99. Now, it is still a hefty price tag. I'm not going to lie about that. But if you want good performance at a price point that once you start to upgrade the other machine is going to take you even higher than this, this is pretty much a really good contender. Here's a chart of recommendations for the regular SoCs that I have been talking about for all these apps: Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, Capture One. So in Lightroom Classic, I still say Max is going to be the better option. The reason why is because it has more GPU cores, and Lightroom can now go in and utilize that on export tasks and many other tasks you're running as well, where in the M1 generation, this wasn't the case, but now it is, and you're going to get much more advantage out of that. If you want the best performance, the Ultra are still going to reign supreme. When it comes to Photoshop, if this is primarily what you do, Ultra will not do you any good at all. And when it comes to good, better, best, the current generation right now, I would say that the M3, regardless of its Pro or Max, you're going to get the best one. In fact, the best one right now, I would probably say, is the M3 Pro with an upgraded memory. In fact, the base 14-inch one with the upgraded 36GB memory, it's going to do you really good. When it comes to Capture One, M2 Max base SoC, if you can find those on Apple refurbished store or in the secondhand market, best machine right now for Capture One to use because you're saving a lot of money and Capture One's not going to run any faster on the M3 Max anyway. When it comes to any type of video work, I recommend going with the Max or the Ultra SoC because of the double encoder decoder engine on those chips. You're cutting the time that you need to do for any type of rendition, any type of previews that's happening in the machine by quite a bit. RAM recommendation, the minimum, 16, 18. That's really the minimum you're gonna get from these machines anyway, so I'm not worried about that. But if you really want optimal, go with at least 32 or 36 gigabytes of memory, depending on the generation machine you're looking at. And with regards to SSD, 512, it is the minimum, which is a good thing. But if you need a little bit more space, I highly recommend choosing the 1 terabyte model. That's going to stretch you much longer. The other thing to think about as well is how long are you keeping the machine? If you're keeping the machine longer and you want to make this a long-term machine, start looking at upgrading the components because they're going to pay off over time and you're going to have a much better machine in the long run. If you are going to look at a, every cycle update, then I would say stock configuration will probably do you just fine. And you might have to suck it up a little bit where the machine might not be as fast as possible, but those are just things to think about. And remember, when it comes to these machines, yes, you can go in and upgrade to 8 terabyte SSD to the max amount 128 gigabytes of memory or even like 192, but you're going to reach a point of diminishing return by how much you're really spending because once you reach like a certain plateau in an app, it's not going to run any faster because you add any more to it. And if it is faster, I've seen some result, it's by 3 seconds. But you're now spending $1,000 more to get that 3 seconds. For most creative, I highly doubt that's something that is worthwhile. All right, here is an upgrade chart for those of you that want to upgrade, especially if you are on the Apple Silicon already. It kind of gives you a roadmap a little bit as far as how you can move around. For example, the best thing you can do is circle the silicon you currently have and start looking at the arrows where you want to upgrade. If you're okay with going with, for instance, a desktop machine, the M1 Ultra is an amazingly great value right now because you can get that machine that is still, for the most part, outpacing the M3 Max, right, at a much cheaper price as well. So something to think about there. The best performance right now is the M2 Ultra, and if you're looking at this machine from this generation, you can see how the chart's going to go, so you can decide a little bit better. But any questions, you can always leave them in the comments too. Anyway, I hope that you find this comparison and this review helpful. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.